Okay, so picture this. You're a young woman in Perth, 1980s Perth. You get a ride from a couple. They seem harmless enough, but instead of getting to where you're going, you end up trapped, like in a nightmare. And that's what happened to several women. At the hands of David and Catherine Birnie, this is their story, the Moorhouse Murders. We're not just going to cover like what happened, but why. What would lead a couple, seemingly normal couple, down such a messed up path? So today we've got court transcripts, psych profiles. We've even got some firsthand accounts. Let's try to make sense of this. Let's start with David, his childhood. It wasn't exactly, happy families, dysfunction. There are whispers of alcoholism, promiscuity. There are even rumors of incest. And get this, family meals, practically non-existent. Or can you imagine the impact that kind of upbringing has on a developing mind?
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on there. When you don't have those basic needs met, structure, stability, healthy emotional connections, it can really create a breeding ground for issues later in life. Not saying it's a direct pipeline to becoming a killer, but it definitely makes you wonder about how that kind of environment, how it might have shaped David psychologically.
Okay, so we've got this chaotic family life, but then things get really dark. When you look at David's early crimes, so we've got animal cruelty while he was a jockey apprentice, and then there's that attempted rape where he wore stockings over his head. I mean, it's pretty disturbing stuff. What do you think about that? How would criminologists interpret these early behaviors? Is there a connection between something like animal cruelty and then escalating to more serious offenses?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. Acts like animal cruelty, they're often seen as more than just like isolated incidents. They can be really powerful indicators of a deeper disturbance. In a lot of cases, it foreshadows a willingness to inflict pain, to exert control over others. And then you add the attempted rape to that, especially with the stockings, that adds a whole other layer, suggests a pattern developing, a pattern of deviance, fascination with power, control. And you've got this fetishistic element mixed in there as well.
It's like you're piecing together a puzzle, looking for these early warning signs. Okay, let's shift gears for a second and talk about Catherine. Her early life seems almost normal, at least until she was 2. And then tragedy. Her mother dies during childbirth.
Yeah, the loss of a primary caregiver, especially at such a young age, it can have profound effects that can last. It often disrupts a child's sense of security, attachment.
Right.
Which can manifest in lots of ways later in life. And then you've got the instability after that, moving between grandparents, caught in custody battles. It's just a recipe for emotional turmoil.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. You go from this seemingly stable upbringing to all this chaos, but then things take another turn. Catherine ends up with the McLaughlins, a seemingly stable family. She marries young, has 7 children. It sounds like she escaped that turbulent past. So how do we make sense of this? How do we reconcile this with her later involvement with David and the crimes they committed together?
This is where it gets really complex. On the surface, it seems like she built a stable life, escaped the turmoil of her childhood. But maybe those early experiences, maybe they left scars deeper than we realize. Maybe there was a lingering vulnerability there, a search for something or someone to fill a void. And that's where David comes in. You have to consider the possibility that he exploited that vulnerability, manipulated her into a situation that she couldn't escape. It's a classic example. Even someone who seems to have it all, they can still be susceptible to manipulation, to abuse.
And that brings us to the point where their paths converge and things take a very dark turn. For 5 weeks in 1986, Perth is gripped by fear as the Birnies go on a horrifying crime spree that would stain the city forever.
What's really chilling about this period is just how calculated their crimes were. It wasn't just this random, chaotic outburst. It was a system, carefully constructed. They would lure young women, abduct them, hold them captive, subject them to horrific abuse, and ultimately murder them. They'd bury the bodies in the state forest. This methodical approach, it says a lot about them. Psychologically, it suggests premeditation, a disturbing level of control over their victims.
It's almost unimaginable, the level of planning, the cold-heartedness, and there are these specific details that are just chilling, like the nylon cord they use for strangulation. What is a detail like that, something so seemingly mundane, what does it tell us about their mindset?
The choice of weapon, especially in a case like this, it's very revealing. The nylon cord, it's more than just a means to an end. It points to this need for control, a very specific type of control. And some experts think it ties into a theory of ritualistic behavior, a need to exert power in a very specific way, almost ceremonial.
It's unsettling to think about. But understanding these details, it's key to understanding the bigger picture.
Hmm.
And there's another detail that I just can't get out of my head. David.
Yeah.
He stabbed one of the victims to speed up decomposition, something he said he learned from a book. I mean, what does that say about his state of mind?
That is incredibly disturbing on a lot of levels. I mean, first of all, it shows premeditation. He wasn't just reacting in the moment. He was thinking ahead, planning, researching, ways to conceal his crimes. But what's maybe even more unsettling is the influence of external sources. The fact that he learned this technique from a book, it speaks to a chilling detachment. It's like he's treating this horrific act as a subject to study, not a human tragedy.
It's just a chilling reminder. Evil can wear many faces, and that sometimes the most monstrous acts are premeditated and carried out with a disturbing lack of emotion. But there's a glimmer of hope here. We're going to talk about the one victim who managed to escape and whose bravery brought the Birnie's reign of terror to an end. Before the break, we were talking about that system, the one the Birnies developed for their crimes. But their reign of terror, it couldn't last forever. And it was the bravery of one young woman, Kate Noir, that brought their spree to an end.
Her story, it's amazing. It shows how strong the human spirit is, how it can persevere, even when faced with something so terrifying. Imagine being abducted, chained up, threatened, and knowing what's probably going to happen to you based on what you see in the house. But even then, Kate, she stayed calm, figured out her options, and orchestrated her escape.
I remember reading about it. It was like something out of a movie. She didn't just, run off into the night. She left a coded message for her mother. She broke a window. And she even got away from a guard dog.
Exactly. I mean, each of those things, it shows you how quick she was thinking and how brave she was under pressure, like the coded message. That shows you how aware she was. She knew she probably wouldn't be able to talk freely, so she came up with a way to communicate without her captors knowing. And then the window. That was a risk. It could have backfired.
And then there was the dog.
Yeah.
It's like something from a thriller, Adds another layer of suspense to the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That could have stopped her right then and there. But she kept going. And what's important is that as soon as she was free, she went straight to the police. She gave them the details that led to the Birnies being arrested. I mean, she saved lives.
It's a real contrast to all the darkness we've been talking about.
Right.
It reminds you that even when faced with pure evil, hope and resilience can win out. Speaking of contrast, though, let's talk about the Birnies and how they reacted once they were caught. David, he confessed to everything. But Catherine, she said she was innocent. It's an interesting dynamic. What do you make of that, those differing responses?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people have who've studied this case. One way to look at it is that David, he was the dominant one, right, in the relationship. So he felt like those crimes were his. And so he admitted he was guilty. Catherine, though, she might have felt trapped or coerced, maybe even brainwashed. And so she denied everything as a way to cope.
It's like you're trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing. You can speculate, analyze, but in the end, you just don't know what was going on in their heads.
Exactly. It just shows how complex human behavior is, especially when you're talking about extreme criminal activity. You've got motivations, psychological influences, maybe even some external pressures that contribute to what people like the Birnies do. Trying to figure all that out, it's a difficult task.
So we've got this horrifying crime spree, a daring escape, and then conflicting confessions. Even the end of this story, it's full of complexities and unanswered questions.
Yeah, that's something you see a lot with cases like this, that desire for simple answers, for a clear-cut explanation for these horrific acts. It's understandable. But the reality is, it's a lot more nuanced than that. It's messy. You're trying to piece things together, information, psychological profiles, sometimes even speculation, to try and make sense of something that really doesn't fit into any neat category.
Yeah, it reminds you, the human mind, it's a vast place. A lot of it's uncharted territory.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about the extremes of human behavior. But let's move on for a second. Let's talk about the aftermath of these crimes. What happened legally to the Birnies, and what was the impact on Perth? I mean, it was a city that was proud of its safety and community spirit.
The Moorhouse Murders, that's what they came to be known as, they had a huge impact on Perth. It wasn't just the horror of the crimes themselves. It was this loss of safety. People felt vulnerable. They wondered how something so dark could happen in their city. And the trial, it became a national event, which made that feeling of collective trauma even worse.
Yeah, I can see why. This wasn't some, distant crime. It happened in their neighborhoods.
To their friends, their daughters. It was a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in a place that seems as idyllic as Perth.
Exactly. They were forced to confront their own vulnerability, to deal with this idea that monsters aren't always hiding in the shadows. They can look like normal people, like the Birnies.
So we've been talking about the impact of these murders on Perth and how it really shook the city. That sense of security just shattered. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like, living through that, all that fear and uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely. The impact of crimes like this, it goes way beyond the victims and their families. The whole community feels it. They feel vulnerable, and they start to question their own safety. In a way, the Moorhouse murders, they force Perth to confront something, this dark side of human nature, something they maybe didn't think existed in their city.
So let's talk about the legal stuff. What happened after they were caught? The Birnies, I mean, they must have faced serious consequences, right? Oh, yeah, the trial. It was huge. The whole nation was watching. The details were just so chilling, and everyone was trying to understand how could these seemingly normal people do something so monstrous. In the end, both David and Catherine, they were found guilty. David, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder. An abduction and rape. He got 4 life sentences. Catherine, she was found fit to stand trial, and she got the same sentence.
Wow. Life sentences for both of them. That really shows you how serious their crimes were. Did either of them ever try to appeal?
They did, both of them. But neither appeal worked. Catherine, she's actually tried to appeal a few times over the years. She says she was under David's control, that she didn't really want to participate in the murders, but the courts, they've always upheld the conviction. They say she was actively involved, and that she's still a danger to society.
You mentioned control, and it does seem to be a big part of this case, the nylon cord, the way they planned their crimes. It makes you wonder how much of what Catherine did was really her choice, and how much was because of David, his manipulation.
That's a question that people still debate. Some people think she was a willing participant, driven by her own darkness. Others, they think she was a victim too, caught in this web of manipulation and abuse, unable to escape David's influence. It's complicated. There's no easy answer. And it really highlights a bigger issue, understanding power and control in abusive relationships, especially when there's criminal activity involved.
It's a reminder that even in a partnership built on darkness, there can be different levels of guilt, different motivations. But the impact on the victims and their families, that's undeniable. How did the community support them after something so horrific?
The Moorhouse murders, they really left a scar on Perth. And healing, it takes time. It's difficult. There was and still is a focus on supporting the families. Emotionally and practically, you got support groups, counseling services, memorials. These things have helped them cope with the grief and start to rebuild their lives. And for a lot of them, justice, knowing that the Birnies were held accountable, that's given them some closure, a sense that their loved ones didn't die in vain.
It shows you how strong people can be, even after such a loss. There's this desire to heal, to help each other, to find a way to move forward. So what happened to David and Catherine after they were sentenced? Did they spend the rest of their life in prison?
David did. He was in Fremantle prison at first, but then they moved him to solitary confinement because other inmates were threatening him. He stayed in isolation for years, and then he took his own life in 2005.
A sad end to a dark story.
Yeah.
What about Catherine? Did she ever say she was sorry? Or did she still say she was innocent?
Catherine, she's still in prison. She's always denied being fully involved in the murders. She says she was forced by David. She has said she's sorry for the pain that the families have gone through. But her claims of innocence, her trying to downplay her role, a lot of people don't believe her.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into this disturbing case. What are some of the key things you hope people will take away from this?
I think the Moorhouse murders, they show us something. That even seemingly normal people, they can have this capacity for darkness. And it forces us to think about some things, nature versus nurture, the early signs of someone going down a dark path, and the impact of violence on individuals, families, and whole communities.
And something else that's important to remember is hope and resilience. Kate Moore, her courage, it saved her life. And it stopped the Birnies. It proves that even when faced with evil, the human spirit, it can overcome. For everyone listening, I want you to think about this. How can we as individuals and as a society stop these kinds of tragedies from happening? How can we support the victims and their families? And how can we create a culture of awareness and prevention so that hopefully stories like this, they become less common, less shocking, less heartbreaking? It's a tough challenge, but it's one we need to keep working on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.